Masechet Nazir Daf Lamed Zayin. This daf is an essential one for understanding all the laws of Isur v'Heter, when something non-kosher falls into something kosher and gives taste to it. This is one of the main sugyot from which we learn all of these laws. Okay, just back to the context here. In the Mishnah, we talked about the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who said if you have bread and it's soaked in wine and the Nazir eats it, one kazait, then they are liable. And so Rabbi Abhu, in the name of Rabbi Yohanan, said that we learn from here, from the word mishrat, right? Mishrat is the pasuk. Here this is v'chol mishrat anavim lo yishteh, and Rabbi Akiva understood that as bread that's soaked in wine. And based on Rabbi Akiva and the Mishnah, Rabbi Yohanan said, we learn here the principle of heter מצטרף לאיסור, that if it is half a kazait or a little more than half a kazait of wine with half a kazait of bread, it has to be majority of the prohibition, so majority wine, and the Nazir eats it, they are liable because of this principle. So even though it's a combination of permitted and prohibited, if the combination together has a majority of prohibited and it adds up to a kazait, then it's person gets lashes. However, Rabbi Yohanan limits this law only to Nazir. Other sages said it applies to other cases as well. Now, Abaye is challenging Rabbi Yohanan and saying, "Hey, I think it should apply to other prohibitions as well." And he tried to prove that, but Rav Dimi said, "No. In those cases that you brought, those have a different principle that applies to them, and that's kazit בכדי אכילת פרס, which means that if there's the prohibited is more than an eighth of the permitted, and someone comes along and eats a peras worth of it, such that there is a kazait of prohibition within that peras, then they are liable." But this is not the same as היתר מצטרף לאיסור, because in this case, in kazait בכדי אכילת peras, the person is actually eating a kazait of prohibited substance, but it's just mixed in, and he's eating a lot of the substance, such that he does have a kazait at the end. So Rav Dimi says I can explain all those cases with the principle of kazait בכדי אכילת peras, and that's how he refutes Abaye. All right, we have one more such challenge by Abaye before we get to the next section. Here it is. Itibe. Abaye es Rav Dimi. Shete kupot achat shel teruma v'achat shel chulin v'lifnehen shete sein. Achat shel chulin v'achat shel teruma. V'naflu elu letoch elu. Shenehem mutarin. Sheni omer chulin letoch chulin naflu. Teruma letoch teruma nafela. It's in the variation of a braita that we saw before. We have two baskets full of grains. One is teruma and one is chulin. And in front of them are another two containers. One is full of chulin and one is full of teruma. And one of them falls into another. The baskets fall into the containers, and we're not sure which one fell into which. We assume that both of them are permitted, and we assume that the chulin fell into the chulin, so anyone can eat that, even a non-kohen. And it's the teruma that fell into the teruma, and that only a kohen would eat. All right. Now, this has to mean that it's a prohibition midrabanan, because it's a safek, and safek drabanan le'akel. So why would this be a drabanan? Abaye continues and explains, Visa kadatech kezait בכדי אכילת פרס אסור, amay amrinan she'ani omer. So Abaye tells Rav Dimi, how are we going to explain this? Right? What would be the prohibition if one is falling into another? If you explain this according to your principle, the way you explained the previous one, that it's a kazait within a peras, so it's more than an eighth of the teruma that's falling into the other basket, whichever it is, and in that case, that prohibition is a deoraita prohibition, and so you do have to worry that the teruma fell into the chulin, that which would create a deoraita problem, and safek deoraita lehachmir. So this is a problem according to you. Abaye is going to continue and explain why, according to his own opinion, this can make sense by saying it's היתר מצטרף לאיסור. בשלמה לדידידה מן המשום דהיתר מצטרף לאיסור, כגון דנפישי חולין. I can explain this case simply by assuming that we're talking about a case where the prohibited teruma is less than the permitted holin. And because the permitted is a majority, then you do not apply heter מצטרף לאיסור. As we just said, you only say heter מצטרף לאיסור when there's a majority of the prohibited. Then, even if it's just 51%, and you have 51% of a kazait prohibited and 49% of a kazait that's permitted, then that person would be liable. But if it's majority permitted, then that's why it's permitted. So that's why in this case, since there's no deoraita prohibition, we can be lenient. So this makes sense according to me, although he has to make that okimta. But according to you, that applies the principle of Kazait and the peras, there, right, by definition, so you don't need a majority. All you need is 1 out of 8. And so as long as more than 1 out of 8, then it should be the oraita. So you see, your principle doesn't work here. And my principle does. And I'm proving from here that we say heter מצטרף לאיסור also in the case of teruma, not only Nazir, as Rabbi Yohanan said. And so Rav Dimi now is answering for his teacher Rabbi Yohanan. Amar le hanach le teruma bizman Nazir d'Rabbanan. Says no, we're talking about teruma nowadays. That the teruma is the Rabbanan, and so since the entire prohibition is the Rabbanan, that's why we can say safek Rabbanan lekula. Okay, very good. Now, Amar le Abaye. Mimai dehai mishrat leheter מצטרף לאיסור hu de'ata. Now, Abaye is going to start off on an entirely new line of questioning. Right? Rav Dimi answered all the questions before, and so now Abaye goes all the way back to the source of mishrat. And he says, wait a second, you know what? Maybe the pasuk of Mishrat, how do you know that that we learn from here that permitted and prohibited can combine, right? The combination rule, combine to a kazait to make something prohibited. Dilma liten ta'am ka'ikar hu de'ata. Maybe this pasuk is talking about flavor. Ta'am ka'ikar is like substance. That even if you just have flavor, but it's flavor of something prohibited, then it's as prohibited as substance of it. Okay, if we go back to the pasuk, as we mentioned at the beginning of the previous daf, this is the peshat of the case, it seems to me. Right? Chol mishrat anavim, that if you have grapes and you soak them in water, you soak it for a while until the flavor of the water, of the grapes, goes into the water. And even if then you strain out the grapes and you have no more grapes in there's no substance, but there's only flavor, a grape flavored water. And the Nazir is prohibited even for that, right? He cannot drink it. So actually this case seems to be talking about ta'am ka'ikar, right? So this is a very important phrase, ta'am ka'ikar, that even the flavor of something is going to be prohibited, like its substance. So maybe it's referring to that. Now, what's the difference? What's the difference between tam ka'ikar and heter מצטרף לאיסור? Tam ka'ikar is more stringent in a way, because each of them has a stringency the other one doesn't have. Tam ka'ikar is more stringent in that even if there's none of the original prohibited substance, even if I strain out all of the grapes and all I have is grape flavor, that is still prohibited if we apply this principle. On the other hand, heter מצטרף לאיסור applies even if taste does not transfer to the other item. If I have permitted food and prohibited food, let's say fat or something, right, and they're put together, but the flavor didn't transfer. So I didn't cook them together; they're just dry, right? They're mixed together, but they're dry, so the flavor didn't transfer from one to the other. So then you would not apply ta'am ka'ikar, but the heter מצטרף לאיסור would apply, so that if I had a כזית of the whole thing, it would be liable. Whereas tam ka'ikar would say, even if there's nothing of the original, if I have a kazait of the food that has the taste of the prohibited item, then that is also prohibited. Okay, so these are two very different principles. And Abaye says, you know what, I'm looking at the pasuk again, Mishrat, and I think actually we should derive an entirely different principle from it. Now we're wondering about Abaye because he totally changed his line of reasoning. Ul Abaye me karaka kashyale mai de kamar Rav Dimi vekamotiv le kol halen tiyufta hadad amar le liten tam ka'ikar. Abaye, can you explain your line of reasoning here? At first you were challenging Rav Dimi, and he answered all of these answers. Abaye objected with all these objections, and the point of the objections of Abaye was to expand, right? To say, hey, Rav Dimi, and your teacher, Rabbi Yohanan, you're only teaching Heter Misef L'Isur only in Nazir. No, we should expand it, and Heter Misef L'Isur should apply as a stringency. That should apply across the board to all Isurim. And he brought examples of Terumah. And so he's trying to expand Heter Misef L'Isur. Okay, now that all these Rav Dimi answers these challenges successfully, now he's going the opposite direction and saying, oh, you know what? There's no law. Forget the whole law of combination, right? Mishrat is not teaching that at all. And so he goes from trying to expand it to say that, no, this Mishrat teaches something else altogether, ta'am ka'ikar. So why did he change his mind? And the answer is, yeah, he did change his mind. Batar deshani le, amar le, dilma liten ta'am ka'ikar hu de'ata. Right, after Rav Dimi successfully resolved all the challenges, so Abaye said, oh, you know what, you're right. I see that does not apply. This principle does not apply in other cases, only Nazir. But now he wants to go back and says he wants to find some way of finding a principle that is not only for Nazir but can apply to other cases. So he says, you know what? I think Mishrat actually is about Tam Ka'ikar. Okay, Licha de Tanya. Now, Abaye did not make up this rule of Tam Ka'ikar, but rather this comes from a Beraita. Here's the Beraita. Lichedatanya, Mishrat, liten ta'am ka'ikar. The word Mishrat, right, soaking the grapes in water, that teaches that taste is prohibited like the original substance. Shim shara anavim b'mayim v'yesh b'em ta'am yain hayav. Mekana tadan lekodan kol isurin shebat Torah. That if you put grapes and soak them in water and it has the flavor of wine, then, and the Nazir drinks it, he is liable. And we are going to use this as a prototype for all other prohibitions in the Torah. The same thing. If they have some pig and you cook it with vegetables, even if you take out the original substance of the pig meat, but the vegetables have the taste of pig, then they are also prohibited. Okay, Uma Nazir she'en isuro isur olam, ve'en isuro isur hana'a, ve'yesh heter li'isuro, asa botam ka'ikar, kila kerem, she'isuran isur olam, ve'isuran isur hanaya, ve'en heter li'isuran, en odin she'aseh botam ka'ikar. And we're going to learn this based on the Kal Vachomer. From Nazir to all other prohibitions. And we'll just give a couple of examples. So Nazir has a lot of leniencies. And yet it's still prohibited tam ka'ikar. What are the three leniencies of a Nazir? It's not forever, right? I mean, unless you're a Nazir forever, but most Nazirim, standard Nazirut, is only for a limited time period, whereas almost all other prohibitions, pig, right, is prohibited forever. And isur hana'a, a Nazir is allowed to benefit from wine, right? He can have a wine store and sell wine and make money from it. He just can't drink it. Whereas there are some other prohibitions have a prohibition against hana'a, and there is heter li'isura. If a Nazir goes to a chacham and annuls his vow, then he's permitted. So you see, Nazir has all these leniencies, and even though it's a pretty lenient prohibition, taste is like substance, tam ka'ikar. So, kilei hakerem, a different prohibition of mixed seeds that grow near each other, where that's prohibited forever. You could wait for 1,000 years; it's still going to be prohibited, and you're not allowed to get even a benefit from kilayim. And you can't go to a sage and undo it. It's right. It's not based on a vow. So all the more so in kilayim that has none of those three leniencies. It would take tam ka'ikar. And not only that, also huadin le orla bishtayim. Orla only has two stringencies compared to it, because although the prohibition of orla is not a permanent prohibition, because this tree, right, is only prohibited for 3 years, and then the 4th year it's holy, but then you wait till after that, and then you can eat from the tree. So it's true, it's not forever, but it is also asur b'hana'ah, and you can't ask a chacham and undo it. So orla also would apply to, and the truth is, it would apply to any prohibition, because pretty much any other prohibition is going to have a stringency compared to these three leniencies of Nazir. And therefore we can learn from Nazir to all other prohibitions in the Torah that ta'am ka'ikar. So to just look at our outline for a second, here Abaye, he was challenging, right, because he wanted to expand, but Rav Dimi responded. Okay, so we're left with, according to the Yohanan, explaining Rabbi Akiva, we have היתר מצטרף לאיסור. That's what we learned from משרת, that the combination principle, but it applies only to Nazir. That's Rabbi Akiva's position. And now Abaye says, wait a second, I have a Baraita, which is the Chachamim, it's the majority, and they learn from Mishrat Tam Ka'ikar, and it applies to all prohibitions. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to ask about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, since you limit this word Mishrat, first of all, only to Nazir and only to היתר מצטרף לאיסור, you must agree that taste is prohibited, right? What, you think Rabbi Akiva would have something with the taste of pork, and he would eat it, right? So you have to learn it. You're not learning from here. You got to learn it from somewhere else. So where's he going to learn it from? We're going to try out milk and meat. It's not going to work from there. We're going to try from non-kosher pots, right? You see why this sugya is essential for all the laws of pots and pans. Okay, so that's what we're going to figure out now. And here we go. Amale Rahu merabanan. Rabbi Abhu ki kamal Rabbi Akiva. Hey Rabbi Akiva. Ilema Rabbi Akiva dehacha ditnan. Rabbi Akiva omer afilu sharap ito bayayin. V'yesh bo kedei lesaref kazait hayav. Umimai dilma hu deika kazait ba'ayna. Okay, but before we ask about where Rabbi Akiva learns ta'am ka'ikar, we just want to clarify this statement of Rabbi Abhu, way back in the beginning of the sugya, who said in the name of Rabbi Yohanan that היתר מצטרף לאיסור, and he learned it from a statement of Rabbi Akiva, and that's only for Nazir. So all this time we were assuming it's Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. But now we're going to say, actually, that's not so clear. So when Rabbi Abhu said his statement, according to Rabbi Yohanan, and it was following Rabbi Akiva, that היתר מצטרף לאיסור, and for Nazir, which Rabbi Akiva? If it's Rabbi Akiva of here, of this Mishnah, where Rabbi Akiva says, even if someone soaked his bread in wine, and it has enough litzaref to combine to a kazait chayav. That's where we got this combination. It says the word litzaref in the Mishnah. But that could be interpreted differently. No, maybe that means that there's a kazait of wine itself within the bread. And it's just giving an example that, because Rabbi Akiva was arguing on the previous source that says it's a rivi'it, and he said it's a kazait. Kazait is a solid measurement. So he's showing you how you can have a solid measurement of wine, but because if you dip a bread into it and you have a kazait of prohibited substance altogether, then that would be prohibited. And so maybe it's not a combination of bread and wine, but kizait of wine itself. That's what he was saying. And if you say, and if you say, well, isn't that obvious, right? I mean, why do I need to even teach me that? If there's a full kizait of wine, right, that's his whole point, then why do you need to tell me that that's prohibited? Right, Rabbi Akiva, you have to look at the context. Remember, the Mishnah Rishonah there said, no, the prohibition of a Nazir, the minimum amount is a Revi'it. And Rabbi Akiva was saying, no, it's a Kizayit. That's why he had to say his law. Why did he talk about the bread? Oh, the bread was just a side point. It was just an example of how you can have a dry measure of wine. And so we gave an example of bread that's soaked in wine, but really we can't learn necessarily the combination principle from his language there. Litzaref there can simply mean that if you combine together all the wine that's spread out into the bread, and it makes up a kazait, then it's prohibited. Okay, Ela Rabbi Akiva de Baraita, de Tanya Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nazir shesharap ito bayayin, v'achal kazait mipat u'miyayin chayav. Rather, when Rabbi Abhu was referring to Rabbi Akiva, he was talking about Rabbi Akiva in this Baraita, where Rabbi Akiva says, a Nazir that soaked his bread in wine and ate a kazait made up of bread and wine together, chayav. So here you see the combination principle. Okay, really this baraita is actually just expanding on explaining the Mishnah. So the Mishnah probably does mean that also, but the Mishnah is not so clear, so the baraita makes it clearer. Okay, good. So now we understand how the statement of Rabbi Akiva, and now we ask. Amar le Rav Acha bered Rav Avya le Rav Asher. Le Rabbi Akiva dakam mokim le lehai bechol mishrat le'etem yosef le'isur liten tam ka'ikar mina le. All right, very important question. See, everybody is going to agree at the end that tam ka'ikar applies across the board, right? Any prohibited item, even if it's just a taste of the item, is going to be prohibited. And so for Rabbanan, in that Braita that was quoted by Abaye, they learned from Mishrat. This is, go look in throughout the Torah and see how many cases you can find where it talks about something that's just a taste. There's another one we're going to see. But here is definitely a good candidate. It says something soaked in water, and you remove the grapes, and that's prohibited. So Rabbanan learned tam ka'ikar from Nazir, and from there they learned to all other prohibitions. But how about Rabbi Akiva? Since he uses v'chol mishrat to teach heter מצטרף לאיסור, and that applies, by the way, only to Nazir, where is he going to learn tam ka'ikar? And the answer number one is Yalef mi basar bechalav, lav tam be'almahu ve'asur, hachaname la'shena, from meat and milk. After all, if you have a piece of meat and some milk drips onto it and gets absorbed, right? And now the milk is gone, right? There's no substance of milk anymore. It got absorbed. Now there's only a taste of milk, right? The point is that you can't see it. I mean, the milk is in there somewhere. But once it gets absorbed, it's not there in its own form anymore. So that's called just taste. And yet it's prohibited, and so we can learn from there that all other substances as well, we would say tam ka'ikar. Okay, so this is that's where Rabbi Akiva learns it from. And now v'Rabbanan mibasar bechalav la gamrinan dechidushu. Rabbanan say no, we can't learn from basar bechalav. I agree that basar bechalav is an example of ta'am that goes into food, but that is an unusual, it's an exceptional case. It's a chidush, means it's a novelty. And this is a general rule. If you have something that is said one time in the Torah, then you can apply it to all cases in all similar cases in the Torah, unless it's a chidush, right? If there's something about this particular case that is unusual, it's a novelty, then I would say, well, maybe it only applies in that case and not in others. And that's what Rabbi is saying here. Basar b'chalav is exceptional. What's this novelty that makes it exceptional? Here's what's so novel about meat and milk. If you have kosher meat and kosher milk, by themselves, these are two kosher substances. And it's only in the combination of them that it makes something prohibited. Right? This is unusual. It's kind of paradoxical. You should think two kosher things should be even more kosher, right? And that's not true of other prohibitions. If I have non-kosher meat, or something that would use for avodah zarah, right? These are just things that are prohibited and prohibited in and of itself. And so that's the chidush. Maybe ta'am ka'ikar only applies here because it's two permitted substances. Well, it once has such a novelty, so then the ta'am ka'ikar is a novelty there also. So that's why Rabbanan will not use basar b'chalav as a source for all others, and they want to use mishrat. Now, but we challenge Rabbanan because kilayim nameh hay l'chudei shareh v'hay l'chudei shareh u'b'hadeh adadeh asur. In kilayim also, you have one type of plant here, and that's permitted. One type of plant by itself is permitted. If they were planted alone, they would be permitted. It's only that because they are growing together near each other, that's why they're prohibited. So kilayim, see, basar b'chalav is not a chidush. Kilayim also has that factor. So you should be able to use basar b'chalav as a prototype for all other prohibitions. So back to Rabbanan. Why do you need mishrat? Why don't you use basar b'chalav like Rabbi Akiva does? Ela di'itaru lekula yoma b'chalava shareh umevashel lebishulei asur. Here's why. Because if you take meat and milk and you let the meat soak in the milk, right, for many hours, it's still permitted mideoraita, right? Since the Torah says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, we learn that you're not allowed to cook it together, and the eating is only prohibited midoraita if it's cooked together, right? If it's cold and they just touch each other, then there's no deoraita prohibition. Okay, it's still a Rabbanan prohibition, so you still can't, eat a hamburger and have a milkshake together with it, right? But as long as it's not cooked together, it's not a deoraita prohibition. Now, regarding the soaking, incidentally, if you soak it for more than 24 hours, then it's already like it's pickled, and pickling is a type of cooking because then it is going to absorb more significant. We're talking about where it's less than 24 hours, and it's only when it's cooked together that makes it prohibited. That's a novelty. That's not true regarding other prohibitions, because in other prohibitions, as long as the taste goes in, once taste goes in, it's prohibited. Whereas here, even though you could taste the milk in the meat, and you're actually eating, even though you're eating it together, substance, right? If you have a cold cheeseburger that wasn't cooked together, but you just put it on after, that would only be midirabanan. Okay, so you see that basar b'chalav has a chidush, it's a novelty, and that's why we could say, tam ka'ikar works over there because of this unusual thing that has to actually be cooked together. So we can't use that for other things, not Rabbanan and not Rabbi Akiva either. Sorry, Rabbi Akiva. So now we're going to go back to Rabbi Akiva. So this is good for Rabbanan because they have Mishrat, so they don't want any other place to learn it from. So Rabbi Akiva name basar b'chalav chidushu ela yalif migi ole goyim. Now Rabbi Akiva cannot use basar b'chalav. Rabbi Akiva, where are you going to learn the principle of tam ka'ikar? And the answer is from the purging of vessels of Gentiles. So when the Bnei Israel conquered the Midianites, and they took their vessels, they had to kosher them, as we see in this pasuk, right? El-Azar Kohen told them, all the vessels, asher yavo ba'esh, taviru ba'esh. If they are usually used to cook in fire, then you have to pass them through fire in order to kosher them. Right, and so this is where we learn the basic principles, that if something is used in fire, you have to kosher it in fire. Something in a pot, right, on the stove, you have to use it you have to kosher on a stove, and so on. So what do we see from here? Mema da'asire ge'ule goyim lav tama be'al mahu ve'asur hachaname lashena. So we learn from these pesukim that you have to, that the vessels of Gentiles is prohibited. Why? Isn't it only taste? Right? It's not like when we go and conquer them and we take their pots. It's not like we're taking it with the food inside and eating their food. We're talking about empty pots, right? And you clean them out. And even though there's no substance of any food in it, nevertheless it requires purging, because it has taste in it, and the next time you use the pot, then even if you put kosher food, it's going to have taste of the previous dish that was non-kosher in it. And so we learn from here that taste is prohibited. So so Rabbi Akiva says, I can learn it from here. So now Rabbi Akiva has Mishrat, that's for the combination principle, and Gi Ole Goyim, that's where we learn the Tam Ka'ikar. Now, Ul Rabbanan Nameh Tepuk Lehu Migi Ole Goyim. Now a challenge to the Rabbanan. Why do you need Mishrat to teach you Tam Ka'ikar? Why don't you learn it also from Gi Ole Goyim? Amar lehatam chidushu da bechol Torah kolano ten tam nifgam mutar vegabe Gi Ole Goyim asur. He says, no, this is also a novelty. It's an exceptional law, because in the rest of the Torah and other laws, if it's a bad taste, then it's permitted. If you have some pig or whatever, and it gets rotten, and now it doesn't taste good, that there's no prohibition of eating it anymore. Whereas Giulei Goyim, even though the taste is not good, right? Let's assume that these pots were not used for 24 hours. That's a general principle. Once something is left for 24 hours inside the pot, then we assume that it's not going to give a good taste, and yet you still have to kosher it. So you see that this is a chidush, and that's why we cannot learn it from there. It is a case of ta'am ki'ikar, ka'ikar, but we can't use that to learn to everywhere else. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, what are you going to answer to that? How could you learn from Giulei Goyim if in that case even something that tastes bad is also prohibited and you have to kosher it? Says, no, we think it's that actually Giulei Goyim is the same as all other prohibitions, that it's only asur midoraita if it was used on that day, because if it's used with less than 24 hours ago, then it's not called tam lifgam. It's actually a good taste, right? If you cook something in a pot and there's some whatever flavor in it, and then you cook something within 24 hours, people actually like that. Oh, it tastes better. And so actually on a deoraita level, I agree with you on a doraita level and all other prohibitions. Only if it has a good taste, then it's prohibited. And also for Giulei Goyim, only if it's a good taste. The fact that we today, first of all, for all other prohibitions, even if it doesn't taste so good, we're still not going to eat pork. And also we kosher pots and pans even after 24 hours. Lecha techila. Okay, that's all derabanan. But so Rabbi Akiva says, no chidush, we think it's the same as everything else. V'Rabbanan, so Rabbanan, what are you going to do with that? Oh, see, it's the same. It is the same as everything else. And really, you only have to kosher pots mid-deoraita if it was used within less than 24 hours. So Rabbanan respond to that. No, they say even a pot that was used recently, it's impossible that the taste is not slightly tainted, because once it gets absorbed into the vessel and comes back out, right? Who wants to eat that? It's not after 24 hours, then it's an even worse taste. But even before 24 hours, it's not a good taste. It's somewhat tainted, somewhat bad. And even so, on the doraita level, you have to go and kosher the pots. That is a chidush. Whereas for all other obligations, if the prohibited item is still tasting good, and then it's prohibited midoraita. Once it doesn't taste good, then it's permitted mid-deoraita. And so that's why Rabbanan will not learn from the pots, but Rabbi Akiva does learn from the pots. And so this is now, to summarize what we have so far, everybody agrees that Ta'am Ka'ikar is a principle that applies across the board. Rabbi Akiva learns it from Mishrat. Rabbi Akiva learns it from the pots, and he uses Mishrat for a combination principle, whereas Rabbanan, they learn Ta'am Ka'ikar from Mishrat, right? So Rabbanan learned Ta'am Ka'ikar from Mishrat. Rabbi Akiva learns it from koshering pots, and he uses Mishrat for the combination principle. Now, Amar le Rav Acha bered Rav Avya le Rav Asher med Rabbanan nishma le Rabbi Akiva. So now we say Rav Acha tells Rav Asher, based on what Rabbanan said, we can learn something about what Rabbi Akiva would say or should say. Rabbanan, they took this pasuk of Mishrat, of soaking grapes, and they learned from there that Ta'am Ka'ikar, and they learned from there a prototype to all other prohibitions in the Torah. Now, we see that strategy of Rabbanan. I know Rabbi Akiva disagree that this is a source for, but let's also learn a parallel strategy. The Rabbi Akiva nameh, how come Rabbi Akiva, since he learns also from Mishrat, a different law, he learns the combination principle, how come he doesn't use that as a prototype to apply the combination principle to other prohibitions in the Torah, right? If Rabbanan can use Mishrat as a prototype, Rabbi Akiva should also be able to use Mishrat as a prototype for the law that they do. How come they don't say the combination principle for the whole Torah? They limit it only to Nazir. Okay, good question. Amar le mishum daveh nazir vehatat shnei ketubim b'hem ke'achad v'chol shnei ketubim b'hem ke'achad en melamedin. Nazir hadamaran hatat ma'hi. He says, I'll tell you why. Because you have not only the case of Nazir where you have a combination principle, you also have a hatat offering, also we're going to see in a second, has a similar combination principle in the Torah. And here's a general rule. Anytime the Torah gives you two sources to teach the same law, you cannot learn them as a prototype. Why? The logic is, if the Torah wanted you Torah is not going to necessarily repeat everything in every single instance, right? So very often it'll say something in one case, and you say, oh look, if that's true in one case, it's true in all cases. Tam ka'ikar in one case, fine, I can learn that all other cases will be the same, unless there's no overriding factor otherwise. But if the Torah goes out of its way to say that this factor applies in two cases, well, why do you need to tell me two cases? One would be enough, and then I can learn to all the others. If the Torah is telling you in two cases, it means it wants to specify only those two cases. Don't learn it to anywhere else. And so that's what we're answering on behalf of Rabbi Akiva, because it says this law, the combination principle in two cases. All right, now what are the two cases? Nazir is one that we just said. Chatat mahi. What's the case of chatat? The Tanya kol asher yiga bibsara yikdash. In the context of korban chatat, says anything that touches the korban, the flesh of the korban chatat, also becomes consecrated. Now, yachol afilu shelo bala tamud lama bibsara ad shibla bibsara. So what do you mean? Just touch, even for a second, even if it didn't absorb any taste? No, that's why it adds the word bibsara. It could have just said kol asher yiga yikdash. Bibsara means its flesh has to actually absorb some of from the taste of the flesh. Okay, now when it says yikdash, it doesn't mean it actually becomes holy and becomes like a korban itself. It means that we're going to have to apply the prohibitions, because the korban chatat has many prohibitions regarding who can eat it, when they can eat it. Only a kohen, right? Only in a limited amount of time, and has to be treated with special kedusha. And so if it touches other meat, even if it touches like a shelamim, which is lesser, also kodesh, but of lesser is kodesh, kadashim kalim, not kodesh kodashim, it still makes the other meat prohibited. Okay, so this is Akiva. So we're assuming that it's some kind of case where they touch, and it gets mixed together, right? Some of it gets mixed together. Maybe some fat or something gets put on the other one, and so now there's a mixture, and we're going to apply the combination principle here as well. Now the Braita continues and explains itself. So yigdash, that the new meat becomes consecrated, means it becomes like the chatat offering. If the chatat was a disqualified offering, then this meat that it touches will also be disqualified. And if it's kosher, then it can be eaten, the chatat, then the meat that it touches also can be eaten, but with the same stringencies as the korban chatat. Okay, so now what you see is that in the case of korban chatat, where the pasuk here also is talking about chatat that has many prohibitions regarding it and touches some other meat, and we're assuming it somehow gets mixed up, so we can learn the combination principle. And so we learned the combination principle here also. So now we have two sources, Nazir and Hatat, and both of them teach the combination principle. And since it has two sources, we cannot learn from it to any other case, and that's why Rabbi Akiva does not use them as a prototype. Good. Now that we saw that, let's go back to Rabbanan. Rabbanan, Serichi, Rabbanan, how come you don't do the same thing? Why don't you say, take Nazir and learn Tam Ka'ikar there, and take the Chatat offering and learn Tam Ka'ikar also there. Prohibited meat, touched permitted meat, and let's assume now just the taste went in, but none of the substance, right? It touched, and now it tastes like some of the Chatat went into the other meat. And then that would be two sources that teach the same thing, and now you cannot use it as a prototype, Rabbanan. And so Rabbanan will answer, no, Serichi, I need it, and I need to learn to teach Tam Ka'ikar in both Nazir and Hatat. So here's a exception to the principle of two sources. If you have two sources and they're exactly the same, and Torah goes out of its way to teach you, then you cannot use them as a prototype. But if there's a good reason for the Torah to have to tell you in case one and in case two, because you wouldn't be able to learn them from either one from the other, then you can take both of those together and you can use them as a prototype to all others. But you have to explain why it's necessary and why you couldn't learn one from the other. So Rabbanan says, I need both. Dikatav lachamana gebechatat have mina nazir la'atemine mishum de nazir mikodashim la yelfinan. If it only said regarding korban hatat, I would say that nazir cannot be learned from hatat, because there's a general principle that you don't learn from kadashim to nazir. The whole realm of kodashim has own very special laws, very stringent, and we don't generally learn from kodashim to non-kodashim laws. So that's why you're going to definitely need to say it in Nazir. And v'katab rachaman agabe Nazir, if you only had it regarding Nazir, have amina, min Nazir la yafin mishum dehamid isured afilu harsan asir le hilkach la'at yamine. Then I would say also, maybe I cannot learn tam ka'ikar from Nazir to other prohibitions, because and not to korban hatat, because Nazir has a stringency. A stringency is that even grape seeds that aren't very edible still are prohibited. So I might say, oh, that's why tam ka'ikar there, because even the grape seeds are prohibited. But I wouldn't be able to learn from there too hatat, and that's why the Torah has to tell me regarding hatat and regarding nazir, the law of tam ka'ikar. But since I need both of them, I couldn't learn one from each other. That's why the Torah has to tell me both of them. But I can learn from those as a prototype to all others. So that's according to Rabbanan. We need both of them for their individual contexts. And yes, we can learn tam ka'ikar to all prohibitions. Now, Rabbi Akiva amar lach, Rabbi Akiva, back to you. Don't you need both of them? And you can't learn Nazir from Chatat or Chatat from Nazir. And therefore, since there's a good reason to say both of them, how come then we should use them as a prototype to learn the combination principle to all prohibitions? So no, what do I need them for? I agree with what Rabbanan just said in one direction, that if you only said regarding korban hatat, then we couldn't learn Nazir from it, because we don't learn laws about chulin from laws about sacrifices. So yes, I do need the Nazir one. But the Torah could have said it just by Nazir, and I could have learned Chatat from it, because we can learn from all these, after all these Sunnah Shabbat Torah, we can learn from Nazir. If something isn't, there's no particular reason why Nazir is more stringent. So you see, Rabbi Akiva does not think that the prohibition against the grape seeds is a big deal, right? People eat grape seeds. It's not such a crazy thing that's totally unedible. And so there's nothing special about Nazir that makes it a novelty. You could just say Nazir, and if it only said it regarding Nazir, the combination principle, I would learn to all other prohibitions. But because the Torah went out of its way and taught it in Nazir and in Hatat, that means it wants to limit it only to those two. And so therefore, according to the Rabbi Akiva, combination principle only applies to those two contexts, whereas tam ka'ikar, he learns from koshering pots. Good. Now back to Rabbanan. Rabbanan amri lach, hatat leheter מצטרף לאיסור וחולין bekadashim la gamrinan. Now Rabbanan, what are they going to do with the hatat source? They're going to say, okay, hatat, I have to agree with you in the end here that hatat is actually it will teach me heter מצטרף לאיסור, because Rabbanan, don't they agree with the principle of chatat of the combination principle at all? So it says, yeah, we do. And so from the law of hatat, we'll learn the combination principle, although it's only going to apply to hatat. And because chulin from kodashim, we don't learn. We can apply a law in sacrificial meat to sacrificial laws to non-sacrificial laws. So according to Rabbanan, in the end, even though just above they were applying chatat to mean tam ka'ikar, but actually you don't need it there, right? Because we have Nazir. So they were agreeing with this in the end, and the grape seeds aren't important. Okay, so for Rabbanan, they're going to learn from Mishrat and Nazir. We learn tam ka'ikar across the board for all of the Torah, whereas Hatat teaches us the combination principle. Rabbanan do not apply the combination principle to Nazir. Umishrat iten tam ka'ikar. Okay, further according to Rabbanan, Mishrat is going to teach us tam ka'ikar. Mikana tadan nechol isurin shabbat Torah, and we can learn all prohibitions from Mishrat, that tam ka'ikar. And now to summarize with Akiva, Tarvayu le'eter מצטרף לאיסור, והבו lehu שני כתובים בהם כאחד, וכל שני כתובים בהם כאחד, en melamedin. So they would say that Nazir, the Mishrat pasuk, and Hatat are both teach us that the combination principle. Since there are two pisukim about it, two pisukim that come together as one cannot be used as a prototype to others. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the combination principle applies to Hatat, and that Rabbanan agree with that. So they both agree that the Hatat is teaching the combination principle. Rabbi Akiva adds, he's more stringent in this sense, that he says that the combination principle is learned from Mishrat, and so applies also to Nazir. And Rabbanan disagree with that. They don't think the combination principle applies to Nazir. And when it comes to tam ka'ikar, both agree that tam ka'ikar applies to everything in the Torah. Rabbi Akiva learns it from the prohibited from koshering pots, and Rabbanan learn it from Mishrat regarding Nazir. And so you see how important this sugya is. This is the primary source for tam ka'ikar. All the laws of kosher and non-kosher, one taste of one mixing into the other, primarily through pots and pans. This is the major source for that halacha. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.